January 1943. High above Western Europe, the winter air is thin and brittle, stretched tight over cloud tops the color of dull steel. At altitude, German fighter pilots scan the sky with practiced ease. They have been doing this for years. British bombers, American formations, familiar silhouettes, familiar threats. Then something new appears. It is larger than expected, broader, heavier, a single-engine fighter that looks swollen, almost clumsy, its fuselage thick around the nose. The Germans notice it immediately. They comment on its size, its weight. Some laugh. A fighter, they believe, should be lean, agile, light enough to dance. This one does not look like it wants to dance. The aircraft holds its line. It does not peel away easily. It does not scatter when fired upon. It stays with the bombers, steady and unhurried, as if it were built for punishment rather than When it turns, it does so deliberately. When it fires, the sky ahead of it seems to harden. No one understands it yet. Not fully. And in those early moments, high above frozen fields and fractured clouds, the laughter comes easily, because the deadliest things in war are often misunderstood at first. By the time American aircraft appeared regularly over Europe, the air war already had a rhythm and it favored Germany. Since 1939, the Luftwaffe had fought across Poland, France, the Low Countries, and the Soviet Union. Its pilots were veterans of continuous combat. Its doctrine was refined through experience. Speed, climb rate, and aggressive interception defined success. Britain had survived the Battle of Britain, but only narrowly. The Royal Air Force learned hard lessons about daylight bombing, escort limitations, and attrition. By 1941, those lessons were written into every sword. Bombers were vulnerable. Fighters could protect them, but only within strict limits. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did so with confidence and theory. The leadership of the United States Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing, tight bomber formations, heavy defensive guns, and disciplined crews would, in theory, fight their way through enemy skies. Fighters, they argued, were useful but not decisive. Reality arrived quickly. American bombers flying from Britain into occupied Europe faced a mature, lethal defense system. German radar stations provided early warning. Ground controllers vectored fighters precisely. Interceptors attacked in waves, head-on passage, climbing assaults, coordinated strikes. The bombers' guns helped, but losses mounted. The central problem was distance. Early American escort fighters, Sukhoi, the P-38 Lightning, and the P-51 Mustang, in its initial configurations, either suffered from reliability issues or lacked the range required for deep penetration missions. Once escort fighters turned back, bombers continued alone. German pilots waited for that moment. They called it the gap. By mid-1942, daylight raids beyond the French coast became exercises in endurance and La Schweinfurt, Ahrensburg and Bremen. Each mission exposed the same truth. Bombers without constant escort were vulnerable, regardless of formation discipline. From the German perspective, this was confirmation rather than surprise. The Luftwaffe had structured its fighter force precisely for this role. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 were built to climb fast, strike hard, and disengage quickly. They were lighter than American designs, smaller in profile, and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. German assessments of American aircraft during this period were dismissive but measured. U.S. fighters were seen as rugged, sometimes overbuilt, reliable. Yes, but unsophisticated. American pilots were considered brave but inexperienced. Their machines, in German eyes, lacked finesse. This perception extended to aircraft philosophy itself. European fighter design emphasized performance at the edge, maximum climb rate, tight turning radius, minimal weight. American engineers, influenced by different industrial realities, favored durability and firepower. Two German analysts that translated into excess, unnecessary mass, slower response. It was not mockery. Alone it was logic. grounded in existing air combat experience. And yet, even as losses mounted, the U.S. did not abandon daylight bombing. Instead, American planners searched for an escort fighter that could survive where others failed, one that could fly with bombers all the way to their targets, one that could absorb damage, fight at altitude, and still return home. The solution would not come from shaving weight. It would come from embracing it. By late 1942, while bomber crews memorized emergency drills and fighter pilots counted fuel minutes, a new aircraft was entering operational units. It did not resemble the elegant interceptors of Europe. It was thick around the nose, heavy in construction, built around a massive engine and a philosophy that rejected fragility. At first glance, it seemed out of place in a sky ruled by speed and agility. But the air war was about to change, not because American doctrine was proven right, but because American engineering had quietly prepared for a different kind of fight. A fight where survival mattered as much as victory. The aircraft that would challenge European assumptions about fighter design did not begin as a compromise. It began as an answer to a problem the war had made unavoidable. In 1940, even before the United States formally entered the conflict, American planners were already watching Europe closely. Reports from Britain were blunt. Fighters needed range. They needed altitude performance. And above all, they needed survivability. Speed alone was not enough if an aircraft could not stay with bombers or bring its pilot home. At the center of the response was Alexander Kartveli, chief designer at Republic Aviation. Kartveli did not believe the answer lay in chasing European designs. He believed American industry could do something different, something heavier, more powerful, and more resilient. The heart of his design was the engine. Instead of a sleek inline power plant, Kartveli built his fighter around the Pratt & Whitney R2A, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower. It was large, it was heavy, and it demanded an aircraft that could carry it without compromise. To exploit that power at high altitude, the design incorporated a turbo-supercharger mounted deep in the fuselage, behind the cockpit. Ducts carried exhaust gases backward, spun the turbine, and forced compressed air forward again. The system was complex. It added weight, it added vulnerability, but it worked at altitudes where other fighters began to gasp. This aircraft could still breathe. As the design evolved, weight accumulated quickly. Armor plating was added around the cockpit. The fuel system was reinforced. The airframe itself grew thicker, stronger. By the time the prototype flew, the aircraft was already the heaviest single-engine fighter yet conceived. It was designated the P-47. In CIDO's Army Air Forces, reactions were mixed. Some pilots admired its solidity. Others worried about its size. Compared to European fighters, it looked enormous. The nickname came Isole Jug short for juggernaut. German intelligence noticed it too. Initial assessments of the P-47 were unimpressed. Reports emphasized its weight, its bulk, its apparently poor turning ability. Compared to the nimble Bf-109 or the aggressive FW-190, the American aircraft seemed ill-suited to dogfight. Its silhouette was large, its mass obvious. German pilots believed they understood it before they ever fought it. Even American pilots had doubts. Early training reports noted heavy controls at low altitude and sluggish acceleration compared to lighter fighters. Pilots transitioning from smaller aircraft had to unlearn habits. Energy management mattered more. Altitude became a weapon rather than a comfort. But the aircraft was not designed to fight at low speed. It was built to dive. The P-47's mass gave it momentum. In a dive, it could exceed speeds that enemy fighters hesitated to follow. Structural strength allowed it to absorb forces that would tear lighter aircraft apart. If attacked, a P-47 pilot could drop away from danger fast, straight, and violent. Firepower was equally deliberate. The aircraft mounted 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. This was not refinement. It was saturation. When fired together, the volume of metal sent forward was overwhelming. At convergence range, the effect was devastating. By early 1943, P-47 units began deploying to Britain in meaningful numbers. They arrived quietly. No fanfare, No claims of revolution. 2 German observers. They looked like oversized escorts tempori, inefficient, easily handled. 2 American planners. They were a test. The air war had exposed every weakness of theory. Now, a machine built on endurance, rather than elegance, was about to be judged not on paper, but in combat where laughter fades quickly, and assumptions die hard. The first encounters would decide whether weight was a flaw or a shield. For American pilots, the P-47 demanded a mental shift before it ever demanded skill. Those who climbed into its cockpit for the first time felt the difference immediately. The nose was long. The cockpit sat far back. Visibility forward during takeoff was limited. On T-ground, it felt heavy. In the air, it felt deliberate. This was not an aircraft that rewarded impulsive maneuvering. Early combat training emphasized patience. Altitude mattered. Speed mattered. Turning contests did not. Pilots learned to think vertically rather than horizontally. They learned that survival did not always come from outturning an opponent, but from choosing when to engage, when to leave. For German pilots, psychology worked in the opposite direction. From a distance, the P-47 looked like a mistake. Too large, too thick, too slow to react. German fighter culture prized finesse, tight turns, rapid climb. Against that standard, the American aircraft seemed primitive. Reports from early encounters describe confidency bordering on contempt. That confidence shaped tactics. German pilots attacked aggressively, often assuming the P-47 would bleed energy in turns or fail to respond quickly. What they encountered instead was an aircraft that refused to break apart, ebb and wind heat. One that did not panic under fire. One that absorbed punishment and remained controllable. The psychological balance began to shift when German pilots realized that forcing a P-47 into a defensive dive did not create opportunity, it created separation. The American fighter did not spiral downward helplessly. It accelerated rapidly. And once it was gone, it was often gone for good. Survival changes belief. So does repetition. At the core of the P-47's misunderstood nature was a simple engineering truth. Weight, when managed correctly, could be an advantage. The aircraft's mass allowed it to carry armor without crippling performance. The cockpit was protected. Control systems were robust. Fuel tanks were designed to reduce fire risk. Pilots returned with aircraft riddled with holes, sometimes dozens yet. Still, this was not accidental resilience. It was designed. The turbo supercharger system, complex and maintenance-intensive, gave the aircraft a decisive edge at altitude. Where other fighters lost power above 25,000 feet, the P-47 retained it. Bombers flew high to avoid flak. Escorts had to live there too. The result was consistency. German fighters could climb faster initially, but sustained high-altitude performance was a different matter. Prolonged engagements favored the aircraft that could maintain power without strain. The P-47 did not need to win immediately. It needed to stay present. Its structure allowed for aggressive dives without fear of catastrophic failure. Compressibility effects existed, but pilots learned to manage them. The aircraft's strength bought time to adapt. Lighter fighters did not always have that luxury. Engineering decisions, once criticized as excess, began to reveal their purpose. Each pound carried had a job: protection, endurance, control at speed. This was not elegance. It was persistence. The P-47's 8.5 caliber machine guns were not subtle. They were designed around volume rather than precision. At convergence distance, the combined output was overwhelming, more metal per second than most enemy aircraft could endure. This changed how pilots fought. Instead of prolonged dogfights, American pilots learned to strike quickly and decisively. A single pass properly aligned could destroy or cripple an enemy aircraft. Even near misses caused damage. Control surfaces shredded. Engines punctured. Cockpits compromised. German aircraft were not lightly built, but they were not built for this level of sustained fire. Firepower also altered morale. German pilots reported engagements where brief exposure to American fire proved catastrophic. It was no longer about avoiding hits, it was about avoiding proximity altogether. The sky became narrower. For bombers, the effect was immediate. Escorts that could inflict damage quickly were escorts that could stay close. The P-47 did not chase kills at the expense of formation integrity. Its presence alone disrupted attacks. The doctrine shifted from pursuit to denial. Enemy fighters were not always destroyed. Often, they were driven away, damaged, shaken, or unwilling to re-engage. That was enough. Bombers survived. Missions continued. When theory met combat, the P-47's weight, firepower, and resilience stopped being separate features. They became a single system, one that punished mistakes severely and forgave its own. All of its psychology, engineering, and doctrine was about to be tested repeatedly. As combat experience accumulated, tactics around the P-47 evolved quickly and decisively, and each test would make one thing clearer. The laughter heard in early encounters was already becoming rarer. Early missions revealed its limitations in turning fights, but they also exposed a strength that doctrine soon embraced: energy dominance. P-47 pilots learned to stay high. Altitude was not simply safety, it was currency. From above, they could choose when to engage. The aircraft's mass translated into momentum, and momentum translated into speed. In a dive, the P-47 accelerated faster than most German fighters could safely follow. This gave rise to a methodical style of combat. Attack from above. Fire once, break away. Climb again. The Germans called it boom. To follow the dive risked structural failure or loss of control. To stay high meant conceding initiative. The Americans refined it. German fighters attempting to counter these attacks faced a dilemma. Either choice reduced effectiveness. The P-47 did not need to outmaneuver the enemy, it needed to control the geometry of the fight. By mid-1943, this approach became standard. Escort formations layered themselves vertically. Some aircraft guarded bombers closely. Others orbited higher, waiting. German pilots found themselves attacked from unexpected angles, often without warning. Combat became less about duels and more about positioning, and positioning favored the heavy fighter. German pilots, reports from 1943 onward, show a noticeable change in tone. Early descriptions emphasized the P-47's size, and later ones emphasized its speed in the dive and its resistance to damage. Encounters that once inspired confidence now inspired caution. Pilots began to avoid prolonged engagement, unless conditions were favorable. Luftwaffe training emphasized exploiting weaknesses, but the P-47 offered few exploitable ones that could be reliably repeated. It did not burn easily. It did not disintegrate under fire. It did not stall predictably. German aces adapted, but adaptation came at a cost. Attacks required precision and patience, resources increasingly scarce as pilot experience declined. Veteran pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. Newer pilots lacked the instinct to disengage at the right moment. The psychological shift was subtle but real. German pilots no longer assumed superiority when encountering American escorts. They evaluated. They hesitated. And hesitation in air combat is often fatal. The sky, once familiar, became uncertain. The aircraft they once mocked now dictated terms. Beyond tactics and kill ratios, the P-47 carried a moral consequence that rarely appears in design specifications. Bomber crews noticed the difference. With escorts that stayed longer and fought harder, bomber losses declined. Crews felt less isolated. Morale improved. Missions that once felt like near-suicidal penetrations now carried a sense, however cautious, of protection. Tiefsmatered. Strategic bombing relied not just on machines, but on human endurance. Crews flew repeated missions under extreme stress. Knowing that escorts would not abandon them early altered that psychology. Fear did not disappear, but it became manageable. For American pilots, the aircraft's survivability meant survival. Pilots returned with damaged aircraft that would have doomed others. Every return meant experience preserved. Experience meant Effectiveness. In contrast, German losses became permanent. Aircraft could be replaced, pilots could not. As attrition mounted, the Luftwaffe is dulled. The P-47 was not the sole cause of this shift, but it was a contributor at a critical moment. The moral balance of the air war tilted incrementally, mission by mission. By late 1943, the P-47 was no longer judged by appearance. It was judged by results. The heavy fighter had reshaped expectations, rewritten tactics, and altered the emotional landscape of the sky. The laughter that once greeted its arrival had been replaced by something else. Calculation, because the next phase of the air war would not be about proving the aircraft's worth, it would be about the moment when its presence tipped the balance entirely. And that moment was coming fast. The reckoning did not arrive in a single battle. It arrived in a sequence of missions where outcomes became unmistakable. By early 1943, American daylight bombing deep into Germany had resumed with grim determination. Targets were no longer limited to coastal infrastructure. They lay inland industrial cities, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories. The distances involved guaranteed prolonged exposure to German defenses. If the escort failed, the mission failed with it. The P-47 was now present in strength. On long escort days, formations of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator climbed toward cruising altitude, while P-47 squadrons took station above and around them. The escorts did not wander. They did not chase every contact. They held position, waited, and watched. German interceptors still came. They climbed hard to reach the bombers, often at the edge of their performance envelopes. When they appeared, the first attacks were familiar head and passes, designed to break formations quickly. But something had changed. The escorts did not fall away. They were already there. Above. Behind. To the sides. The first turning point was not a single kill, it was Daniel. German pilots who committed to an attack now found themselves intercepted before they could line up properly. A diving P-47 appeared with little warning, firing a concentrated burst, then pulling away at speed. Even when no aircraft was destroyed, the attack was disrupted. Timing was broken. Formation cohesion was lost. Repeatedly, over missions in the spring and summer of 1943, this pattern hardened. German pilots began reporting difficulty closing on bombers without sustaining damage themselves. Escorts were no longer incidental obstacles. They were the main fight. The P-47's strength revealed itself in endurance. During prolonged engagements, German fighters that had climbed aggressively began to lose power. The American escorts did not. At altitude, the turbo-supercharged P-47 retained thrust. It could stay engaged longer, reposition faster, and recover altitude after dives with less penalty. The Germans adapted by attempting to lure P-47s into turning fights or lower altitudes. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. Experienced American pilots refused the invitation. They climbed. They reset. They waited. Combat reports from this period show a marked increase in German aircraft, damaged rather than destroyed, wounded machines limping back, pilots shaken, confidence eroded. For the Luftwaffe, this was a dangerous trend. Damaged aircraft, grounded pilots. Grounded pilots meant fewer sorties meant gaps, and gaps invited pressure. The reckoning became impossible to ignore during the heavy raids of late night, when escort coverage reached further than before, although later variants of the P-51 would eventually dominate long-range escort. The P-47 carried the burden during a critical transition. It absorbed losses, learned under fire, and held the line while doctrine matured. German pilots noted a new risk. The dive. Chasing a P-47 downward became a gamble. The American aircraft accelerated rapidly, its controls stiff but predictable. German fighters that followed risked compressibility effects, loss of control, or structural failure. Breaking off became the safer choice. The American pilot survived, returned, flew again. Survivability multiplied experience. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy escort force. that did not exhaust itself early, did not disintegrate under pressure, and did not abandon the bombers at the most dangerous moment. Losses mounted not in spectacular bursts, but steadily on attritional grind that favored the side with deeper reserves. The sky itself began to feel hostile. German formations that once roamed confidently now moved cautiously. Intercepts required more planning, more fuel, more risk. Every engagement carried uncertainty, not just about the bombers but about the escorts that would inevitably arrive from above. The P-47 had not won the air war, but it had changed its rules. What followed was escalation. The Americans increased pressure. Missions grew larger, escorts more aggressive, and the P-47, once laughed at for its size, became a constant presence, heavy, deliberate, unforgiving. The turning point was nearing, not as a sudden collapse, but as a realization spreading through Luftwaffe command and cockpit alike. The sky was no longer theirs by default, and in the next phase, the consequences of that realization would turn the air over Europe into something far deadlier than anyone had expected. By late 1943, the air war over Europe entered a phase of intensity that left little room for illusion. The P-47 was no longer an experiment or an interim solution. It was a weapon fully integrated into American strategy, and its impact was becoming cumulative. Escort doctrine hardened. P-47 units began pushing outward aggressively, no longer content to merely shield bomber formations. They intercepted German fighters as they formed, struck them before attacks developed, and forced engagements on American terms. This was not recklessness. It was calculation enabled by confidence in the aircraft's survivability and firepower. German fighter losses rose, but more important was how they rose. They rose in ones and twos. Every mission, aircraft damaged beyond immediate repair, pilots forced to bail out veterans lost. These were not dramatic massacres, but they were relentless. The Luftwaffe's strength was being eroded steadily, without respite. The 8.5 Au-caliber machine guns became decisive at this stage. When a P-47 lined up a target, the engagement was often brief. German aircraft, struck by concentrated fire, suffered catastrophic damage. Control surfaces shredded, engines disabled, cockpits penetrated, even near misses produced fragments and shock. German pilots began altering attack profiles to minimize exposure time. That reduced effectiveness. Shorter firing windows meant fewer hits on bombers. The escorts had achieved what doctrine demanded. They denied the enemy time. Simultaneously, the P-47's role expanded. As Allied forces prepared for operations on the continent, the aircraft transitioned increasingly into ground attack. Its rugged construction made it ideal for low-level strikes, rail yards, convoys, airfields. The same qualities that made it hard to kill in the air made it resilient against ground fire. The battlefield widened. German forces now faced an aircraft that could dominate altitude by day and devastate movement below. Supply lines suffered. Troop movements slowed. Psychological pressure increased. The P-47 was not merely contesting the sky, it was shaping the ground war. This compounded the Luftwaffe's crisis. Fighter units were forced to choose between intercepting bombers or defending ground targets. They could not do both effectively. Fuel shortages worsened. Pilot training hours declined. The balance tipped further. American loss rates stabilized. Pilots flew multiple missions. Experience accumulated. Tactical knowledge deepened. The P-47's ability to bring its pilots home, damaged but alive, created a feedback loop of competence. Survivors became leaders. Leaders trained others. The quality gap widened. German confidence eroded. Reports from late 1943 and early 1944 increasingly emphasized avoidance. Engagements were no longer sought aggressively. Pilots conserved energy, waited for numerical advantage, or disengaged early. The air war was becoming defensive rather than assertive. The sky had turned hostile. This shift was evident during the sustained bombing campaigns that preceded the Allied invasion of Western Europe. Escorts were everywhere. The Luftwaffe could no longer mass effectively without incurring unacceptable losses. Each attempt weakened it further. The P-47 did not fight alone. It was part of a system radar, bombers, later long-range escorts, but its contribution during this transitional period was decisive. It held the line when the line mattered most. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to challenge daylight operations had been fundamentally compromised. Not destroyed but constrained, and constraint in war is often defeat by another name. The laughter that once followed sightings of the heavy American fighter was gone entirely. In its place was recognition. Recognition that weight had not been a flaw, that 8 machine guns firing in unison could turn a brief moment into destruction, that an aircraft built to endure could change the character of a campaign. The sky over Europe had become deadly not because of a single machine, but because that machine had forced the enemy into a losing rhythm. And as the war moved toward its next phase, the consequences of that rhythm would be measured not just in victories, but in what followed after the fighting moved on. When the intensity of the air war is reduced to numbers, the transformation becomes unmistakable. By early 1944, the balance of losses in daylight operations had shifted decisively. American bomber formations were still suffering casualties, but not at the rates seen a year earlier. Escort coverage was deeper. Interceptions were disrupted earlier. German fighters were being forced to fight before they reached optimal attack positions. The P-47's contribution to this shift was not defined by spectacular single engagements, but by accumulation. Loss reports from late 1943 show a steady increase in German fighter attrition during escort-heavy missions. Aircraft destroyed in combat. Aircraft damaged beyond repair. Pilots killed, wounded, or captured. Each loss carried disproportionate weight. Germany could replace machines faster than men, but even that advantage eroded as industrial pressure mounted. American losses followed a different curve. While P-47 units did suffer casualties, survivability rates were high relative to exposure. Pilots frequently returned with heavily damaged aircraft hulls in wings, shattered canopies, engine leaking oil yet still flyable. These returns mattered. Every pilot who landed safely represented experience, preserved experience translated into tactical refinement, discipline, and leadership. This asymmetry widened over time. German pilot training hours declined sharply as fuel shortages intensified. New pilots entered combat with minimal preparation. Against them stood American pilots who had survived dozens of missions, flying aircraft that forgave mistakes and absorbed damage. The quality gap grew with every month. Operational data reflected the change. Escort fighters increasingly accounted for enemy aircraft destroyed before bomber contact. Bombing accuracy improved as formations remained intact longer. Abort rates fell. Crews completed missions they would not have survived earlier in the war. The P-47's secondary role as a ground attack aircraft amplified these effects. Rail traffic disruption increased. Vehicle losses mounted. German logistical movement during daylight hours became hazardous. This forced greater reliance on night movement, slowing supply chains and complicating command and control. Air power began shaping ground conditions even before Allied forces set foot on the continent. The Luftwaffe's strategic position deteriorated accordingly. Fighter units were pulled in multiple directions: escort interception, homeland defense, ground protection. Resources thinned. Concentration became impossible. The P-47, operating as part of a broader Allied system, exploited this fragmentation relentlessly. By the time preparations for the Allied invasion of Western Europe reached full intensity, German air resistance was already constrained. Not absent, but the skies were contested in ways that favored sustained Allied operations rather than decisive German intervention. The numbers told a restrained but damning story. German aircraft losses rose steadily. Pilot availability fell. Mission effectiveness declined. Meanwhile, Allied sortie rates increased, and escort effectiveness became reliable rather than hopeful. The heavy fighter, once dismissed as ungainly, had become a constant variable in every German calculation. It did not guarantee safety, but it imposed cost. Every engagement now carried risk that could not be dismissed. Yet numbers alone cannot explain the full consequence. Statistics do not capture hesitation in a cockpit, or the moment a German pilot breaks off an attack early, conserving fuel and aircraft rather than pressing the fight. They do not record the quiet confidence of bomber crews who begin to believe, cautiously, that survival is possible. Those changes are harder to measure, but they shaped the final phase of the air war just as surely as any production figure or loss chart. And as the fighting moved toward its conclusion, the P-47's impact would be judged not only by what it destroyed, but by what it made possible. When the fighting moved west and the tempo of the air war shifted, the judgment of the P-47 became clearer not in propaganda, but in professional assessment. By mid-1944, the aircraft had accumulated a record that defied early expectations. It had escorted bombers through the most dangerous phase of the daylight campaign. It had absorbed punishment at a rate few fighters could match. And it had transitioned smoothly into a ground attack role that extended its relevance even as newer aircraft entered service. Post-mission reports from American units repeatedly emphasized survivability. Pilots described returning with control cables damaged, cylinders shot out, wings perforated. Aircraft that should not have flown did, that mattered more than performance statistics. It meant men came back. It meant lessons carried forward. Maintenance crews noted the same pattern. The P-47 demanded work, but it rewarded it. Damaged aircraft could often be repaired rather than written off. Turnaround times improved. Units maintained operational strength even under sustained pressure. German evaluations, written late in the war, acknowledged the aircraft's strengths with reluctant clarity. It was not described as elegant. It was described as dangerous. Fast in the dive, hard to destroy, armed beyond what was comfortable to face. These assessments lacked the early confidence of 1943. They reflected experience instead. The aircraft's legacy also took shape in doctrine. American air power increasingly favored designs that balanced performance with survivability. Firepower concentration became accepted rather than debated. The idea that an aircraft should protect its pilot rather than trade fragility for marginal performance had been validated in combat. The P-47 influenced how pilots thought about risk. Engagements became choices rather than obligations. Disengagement was not failure, it was survival. That philosophy carried forward into later generations of aircraft and air combat training. For the men who flew it, memory mattered as much as analysis. Pilots remembered the weight on the controls, the long dives, the sound of 8 machine guns firing together. They remembered trust that the aircraft would hold, that it would not fold under stress. That trust created confidence, and confidence created effectiveness. On-the-ground soldiers remembered the sight of P-47s appearing low and fast, attacking supply lines, breaking movement, imposing daylight paralysis. The aircraft became associated not just with air superiority, but with pressure, constant, unavoidable pressure. By the war's end, the P-47 had flown hundreds of thousands of sorties. It had destroyed enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. It had escorted bombers, supported invasions, and punished retreat. It was not the most graceful fighter of the war. It did not need to be. Its steel told the story. Where lighter aircraft bent or broke, it endured. Where theory predicted failure, experience proved otherwise. The P-47's mass, once ridiculed, became its defining strength. And when the shooting finally stopped, its legacy was not framed in laughter or disbelief, but in acknowledgement, earned slowly, through repetition, over hostile skies. That legacy points forward, beyond numbers and after-action reports, toward the broader meaning of what the aircraft represented. War has a way of exposing assumptions with brutal efficiency. Ideas that appear sound in theory are tested without mercy, and only those that endure repetition survive. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered the European air war burdened by expectation and by skepticism. It was judged by its silhouette, its weight, and its refusal to conform to established ideals of what a fighter should be. Those judgments did not survive contact with reality. The aircraft did not win the air war alone. No single machine ever does. but it altered the conditions under which that war was fought. It proved that endurance could be as decisive as agility, that firepower, applied briefly and decisively, could reshape engagement rather than prolong it, that protecting the pilot was not a concession, it was an investment. The P-47 forced a reassessment of values in aerial combat. Speed still mattered. Skill still mattered. But survivability mattered too. Experience preserved today became effectiveness tomorrow. In that equation, weight became an ally rather than a liability. Its story is not one of Elegans overcoming brutality. It is the opposite. It is the story of brutality engineered with purpose, of steel and power designed to endure stress rather than avoid it. The aircraft did not ask for admiration. It demanded respect. The laughter that once greeted its arrival faded because the sky offered no room for illusion. Combat stripped away appearances. What remained was performance under pressure, measured in seconds and decisions, in aircraft that returned and pilots who lived to fly again. In the end, the P-47's legacy rests not in how it looked, but in what it made possible. Bombers that reached their targets. Ground forces that advanced under thinning resistance. Airspace that slowly, decisively, changed hands. History often celebrates the swift and the graceful, but sometimes it is the heavy machine built to endure, to absorb, to persist that turns the air deadly. And when that happens, laughter has no place to hide.